Hey guys, what is up? Welcome back to another video. If you're new here, hi. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I'm so happy that you're here. My name is Jessica and welcome to my channel where I explore new true crime or creepy history topics each week. Last week we actually talked about yours truly in my very first Q&A where I answered all of your burning questions. I will make sure to have that video linked up here in the card for you. Feel free to head over there when you're done here. Or if you're just interested in true crime or the macabre in general and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. With that said, before I get into today's case, please take a second and look at the screen for a heads up of any sensitive topics that will either be covered or implied in today's video. If any of these are topics that you are not in the headspace to hear about right now, then this is not the video for you. Please do what is best for you. That's always the most important thing to me. If that means you're headed out, I completely understand, and I'm sure that I will catch you back here very soon for a different case. But if you're sticking around, let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to be discussing the case of Herb Baumeister. This was a request from one of you guys, so I quickly want to say thank you to Teresa for requesting this one. Herbert Richard Baumeister was born on April 7th, 1947 in Indianapolis, Indiana, to his parents Dr. Herbert and Mrs. Elizabeth Baumeister. He was the couple's firstborn, although they would eventually go on to have a daughter and 2 more sons. Herb's childhood reportedly started off fine. The family was well off thanks to Herbert Sr.'s work as an anesthesiologist, but other than that, his family life is often referred to as pretty unremarkable. It wasn't until Herb reached school age that people started to realize he was a little bit different. Professionals later determined that he was exhibiting obvious antisocial tendencies, but his peers just thought he was kind of gross and kind of weird. He often talked about having a desire to taste human urine, and he also displayed a pretty obvious obsession with dead animals. Yep, human pee and dead stuff. That's what Herbie was into. And he had absolutely no reservations about flaunting these very unique interests. And he satisfied these curiosities by doing things like pocketing a dead crow he found on the side of the road and leaving it on his teacher's desk. And on a completely separate occasion, Herb decided it would be a good idea to just, whip it out and pee all over his teacher's desk. So in my opinion, he clearly also harbored some animosity towards authority figures. As these irresponsible and impulsive behaviors continued, Herb Sr., having a medical background, began to fear that his son might be struggling with something maybe a little deeper than just your typical youthful rebellion. But I mean, let's call a spade a spade. The kid's peeing all over town and pocketing roadkill, so I don't really think it takes any kind of extensive medical training to come to the conclusion that something wasn't right. Nevertheless, hoping to find some concrete answers, Herb Sr. decided to secretly cart Herb off for an extended series of tests, which ultimately led to his son being diagnosed with schizophrenia, a diagnosis that Herb Sr. chose to do precisely nothing about. He requested no further treatment, no medications, not even a second opinion. Just, okay, cool. I was right. Oh no, I'm not gonna do anything about his debilitating mental health issues, but I can slap that hunch in the win column. That is some solid ass parenting right there. So Herb continued to struggle through his youth and honestly through the rest of his life, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. He had a particularly rough time in high school. While his peers were mostly focused on sports, Herb preferred more quiet activities like reading. And even though he really did try, he just could not seem to infiltrate the in crowd. A former classmate of his recalled that eventually he sort of just gave up. He withdrew himself and he just began spending all his time alone. He didn't have any friends, he didn't participate in extracurriculars, and he had absolutely no interest in dating. He just didn't, quote, blend in. But even though the experience was less than desirable, Herb stuck it out and graduated high school before enrolling in college at Indiana University. However, college wasn't like a big, defining, life-changing experience for Herb like it is for most people. Rather, Herb remained pretty flippant about school and didn't really seem to care about continuing his education. He was so disinterested, in fact, that he ended up dropping out of IU after just 1 semester. Not to worry, because Herb Sr. father, who was very well known and very well respected throughout their town, jumped in to save the day. He was able to pull some strings and help secure Herb a job at a local newspaper as a copy boy. And much to everyone's surprise, Herb actually displayed a pretty strong work ethic and a real desire to become somebody in the workforce. But the same old problem continued to plague him. No matter how hard he tried to engage with his peers, he just didn't fit in. And this, unfortunately, just seemed to be a theme of Herb's life. From the newspaper company to a series of menial, short-lived jobs that followed, for a long time, Herb really had trouble maintaining long-term employment due to his increasingly bizarre behavior. He didn't have a long-term, stable job until he began working for the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. Yet another job that his father crusaded for him. But don't for a second think that he kept this job because he finally got his act together. No. He only clung on at the Bureau because they valued his go-get-em attitude and his intelligence more than they cared about his erratic and combative behavior. And because of his very few redeeming qualities, Herb actually didn't even work there that long before he was promoted from his entry-level position to program director. It was kind of starting to seem like maybe Herb was finding his footing. He had a stable job where he was making a comfortable income, and in the early 70s, he even got married. He'd been introduced to Juliana, or Julie Sater, by a mutual friend, and the two hit it off pretty quickly. They shared a lot of similar interests and beliefs, and had a lot of complementing aspirations for their lives. They were married in 1971 in a traditional ceremony at the United Methodist Church in Indianapolis. And for the next few years, the couple remained happy enough, I guess. Happy enough at least to start a family together in the late 70s. Julie quit her job as a high school journalism teacher, and the couple began welcoming children, 3 total. Marie in 1979, Eric in 1981, and Emily in 1984. But just a year after their youngest was born, due to Herb's odd and unpredictable behavior, like keeping a dead cat in a bag in a filing cabinet and peeing on a letter meant to go to the governor, the BMV finally dropped Herb in 1985, and Julie was forced to return to work to replace her husband's income. And unfortunately for Herb and the community at large, this was just the beginning of a real quick downward spiral for Herb. Over the next few years, Herb was involved in a drunk hit and run, and he was arrested and charged with auto theft and conspiracy to commit theft. However, because Herb Sr. was always there to throw his weight around regarding his son's indiscretions, Herb managed to skirt past these events with exactly no consequences or repercussions. He very clearly relied on his father heavily to keep his head above water. So he was hit especially hard by Herb Sr.'s death in 1986. But rather than completely fall apart, surprisingly, Herb harnessed his grief and actually channeled it towards doing something productive. In 1988, he borrowed $4,000 from his mom and invested the money into opening his very own thrift store, which he named Save-A-Lot Thrift. Not to be confused or thought as affiliated with the Save-A-Lot grocery chain located in the Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana tri-state area. This was separate. Believe me, I'm sure they want it made explicitly clear that they were never in any way involved with Herb Baumeister. Herb's Save-A-Lot was created in partnership with a charity known as the Children's Bureau of Indianapolis, and it sold clothing, household goods, and numerous other secondhand items. And luckily for the Baumeisters, Save-A-Lot grew in popularity very quickly. A lot of families in that area were living on pretty tight budgets, and Save-A-Lot offered products of decent quality that easily fit into said budgets. And over its first year in operation, Save-A-Lot made $50,000, which is equivalent to about $120,000 today. I don't need to clarify that that's a lot of money, but it's especially impressive when you consider the fact that most businesses don't turn any sort of profit during their first 2 years. However, Herb was able to make a sizable profit, which he then invested into opening a second Save-A-Lot location. This second store also proved to be quite a lucrative investment. He and his family were able to relocate to the very affluent Westfield district into a $1 million home, which with the busted-ass real estate market we're working with nowadays would probably be worth close to $780 billion. I'm kidding. The inflation calculator says it'd be worth about $2.1 million today, but y'all looked at the housing market lately? Just a mess. Anyways, from the outside looking in, the Baumeisters' lives seemed to be on an upward trajectory. They were living large with no signs of slowing down. However, in reality, behind closed doors, the Baumeisters' marriage was crumbling. minute by minute. They were spending a lot of time apart. More often than not, Julie and the kids would stay at her family's cabin, while Herb would stay back at the 18-acre Fox Hollow farm by himself. Herb and Julie just didn't seem to be enjoying each other's company anymore. And in later years, Julie would admit that over the course of their entire relationship, they never really enjoyed any time intimately together. Aside from what was required to create their 3 children, they basically never spent any time together like that. And while Julie definitely found her husband's lack of interest in intimacy confusing, over time it became something she just lived with. And it would actually be years before Julie would fully understand the cause of her husband's disinterest. Cause being that Herbie had himself a little secret. He preferred to receive his intimacy from other men, majority of which he'd pick up while hanging out at local gay bars. To clarify, Herb was, as far as I can tell, closeted on top of being married. So he definitely wasn't looking for like a deep or meaningful relationship. Hell, he didn't even tell these men his real name. Instead, he operated his pickup game as Brian Smart, a breath play enthusiast. If you're unsure what I mean by that, feel free to look it up. I'm just trying not to upset Papa YouTube, so I'm gonna leave it at breath play. Now, under this alias, persona, whatever you want to call it, Herb began luring young men from these bars back to his home where he'd get them drunk, he'd get them in the pool, and ultimately he would strangle them. But what's crazy is that it's believed that these men actually consented to the strangulation, to an extent. I guess the way that Herb explained things to them posed it as a romantic experience beyond anything they could ever imagine, ultimately convincing them to let him do this to them. And this is a very real thing that people are into, and while I'm not here to yuck anyone's yum, it's important to understand that this can be dangerous enough to engage in when you're dealing with 2 people who want to keep things safe. So it was obviously a big problem for these men that once Herb had them in his grasp, he had absolutely no intention of ever letting up. He knowingly and purposefully took the experience from a sensual adrenaline rush to just full-blown murder. And once he was done, he would move on to his extremely callous disposal routine. The first few times, he actually drove these men out to secluded roads and tossed them over bridges or into small bodies of water. But as he seemed to avoid any suspicion regarding these men's disappearances, he got more and more comfortable and began just discarding them at random across Fox Hollow Farm. And when I say no suspicion was cast onto Herb, it wasn't because he was some stealthy criminal mastermind. Unfortunately, it was more so due to the complete and total lack of effort put into investigating these men's disappearances. Rather than engage in any form of proper investigation, police either brushed the disappearances under the rug, ignored them completely, or chalked them up to just a young gay man living in conservative Indiana who probably decided to uproot and move somewhere more understanding and accepting of his lifestyle. Bottom line is, it seems as though these conservative Indiana cops felt as though they had better things to do than to look into the disappearances of these men because they were gay. But that's just my humble opinion, so who am I? Herb is believed to have started his ruse sometime in the 80s, but it wasn't until 1994 that anyone started looking into it. Not the cops though, nah, they didn't come in until much later. The first person to actually take these disappearances seriously was an independent private investigator named Virgil Vandergriff. Vandergriff became involved in these cases when the mother of one of the missing young men hired him. Her son's name was Alan Broussard, and despite having reported his disappearance to police, she felt as though they were not moving fast enough in investigating his case. And by not moving fast enough, I mean they were literally not moving at all. And coincidentally, while investigating Alan Broussard's disappearance, Vandergriff was contacted by another woman whose son had gone missing and whose disappearance was also not being taken seriously by police. It's pretty obvious if police had lifted even like the babiest of fingers to look into these cases, they probably could have solved them pretty quickly. Because it was not long into Vandergriff's investigation that he received a huge break in the case. And this break came from a man known as Tony Harris. When he heard that someone was finally looking into some of these unexplained disappearances, Tony called Vandergriff to relay to him his own horrifying story. In great detail, he told Vandergriff about a man he'd met at the 501 Club named Brian Smart. And according to Tony, Brian Smart had recently attempted to kill him with a pool hose during a lovemaking session. Tony explained that Brian had invited him back to his employer's home for a nightcap, and that while he'd gone willingly, it didn't take long once they'd got there for shit to get kind of weird. For starters, right when they walked in, Tony was greeted by a bunch of mannequins dressed as party guests and set up around the pool. I guess Herb was trying to emulate some sort of fictional pool party, you know, Kevin McAllister style. And then as the men continued drinking, Herb, or Brian, or whatever the hell we're calling him now, started dropping hints that he'd like to escalate things. He proceeded into his typical spiel about breath play and how it would be like nothing Tony had ever experienced before in his life. He even graciously offered to let Tony be in control first, which admittedly did put Tony slightly at ease. But once the tables turned and Brian took control, it quickly became evident to Tony that this man did not plan to ever let go. Luckily, Tony was quick on his feet, and sensing that he was very much in real danger, he quickly decided to fake passing out in hopes that Brian would let up, which thankfully he did. And after a few seconds, when he felt it was safe to do so, Tony perked back up, much to Brian's surprise, and without missing a beat, Tony boldly began demanding to know if what had just happened to him was what had happened to the other missing men. Now, Herb was just as shocked by the question as he was by the fact that Tony was even still alive, so he just refused to answer. Instead, he responded by telling Tony to get dressed so he could drive him back into town, which is exactly how their time together ended. I bet that was one awkward-ass car ride. What's incredibly infuriating is that Tony tried right away to report what had happened to police. But, big fucking surprise, they didn't take him seriously at all. So Tony had decided to just count his blessings and move on. Thankfully, he happened to come across some posters that Vandergriff had put up regarding his investigation into some of the disappearances. And seeing that someone was actually taking these cases seriously reignited a fire in Tony. He decided that actually he was not going to just move on. Rather, that he was going to reach out to this PI, and together they were going to find this psycho and bring him down. After hearing Tony's story, Vandergriff personally accompanied him to the police station, where he introduced him to a detective he knew who specialized in missing persons cases. And from there, still nothing happened. Meanwhile, things in Herb's personal life were becoming more and more complicated by the second. His marriage was rockier than ever. His Save-A-Lot business had stopped making a substantial profit. He was drinking heavily, which led to some run-ins with the law. And on top of that whole shit show, in 1994, Herb's son Eric found a human skull just chilling out in the open, in the middle of the grass, on the property of their home. Obviously disturbed, Julie confronted Herb, who did his best to assure his family that it was just a skull left over from a cadaver from his father's medical practice. I mean, I don't know how deeply his family actually believed that explanation, but I'd be willing to bet that they were at least like a little skeptical. I mean, his father had been dead for 8 years. Why on earth would he still have a random skull from anything that had to do with his dad being an anesthesiologist? Honestly, it doesn't even matter. His family was the least of his concerns at this point, because unbeknownst to Herb, his little double life was dangerously close to colliding with his real life. The beginning of the end, if you will, happened one night in 1995 when, while prowling around town, Herb made the unfortunate decision to stop into a bar that was also currently being visited by none other than Tony Harris. It's unclear if Herb recognized him or if they had any type of exchange, but what I do know for sure is that Tony definitely recognized him, and he was determined for justice. So before Herb, or Brian as he knew him, was able to leave the bar, Tony made sure to get his license plate number. A little nugget of information that he took immediately to police. And apparently, if you do literally all of the work for them, these police will actually take on your case. Yeah, they took the tip from Tony, looked into the plate information, and were able to quickly identify Brian Smart as Herb Baumeister. Go figure. And now, having their suspect handed to them directly on a silver platter, they decided, maybe we'll go, drop in, see what up with old Herbie. Unfortunately, though, due to a lack of evidence, they weren't able to drop in with any form of a search warrant for the Fox Hollow property. So they decided to just, wing it. They showed up at the Baumeister's door, told Herb he was a person of interest in the recent disappearances, and asked him real nicely if they could search the property and his home. To which both Herb and Julie responded, yeah, for sure not. And this really cramped the investigation. The evidence they needed to form a case against Herb was likely in that house and or on that property, but without a warrant, they couldn't legally obtain any of it, and without any evidence, they couldn't obtain a warrant. So they were kind of stuck, but thankfully not for long. A few months later, Julie finally filed for divorce, and immediately police saw an opportunity. They thought maybe they would have more luck if they got a chance to speak to just Julie, without the influence of her breathing over her shoulder. And luckily for the investigation, since deciding to end her marriage, Julie had become very fearful of her estranged husband's erratic behavior. So she finally gave in and consented to the search after a few requests. And armed with Julie's permission, and with Herb miles away on vacation at their family cabin, police flooded Fox Hollow Farm in hopes of finding any evidence they possibly could to tie Herb to the disappearances. And, their search definitely yielded some interesting finds. Honorable mentions being the mannequins and the pool hose, both of which backed up Tony's story. But far and away the most damning evidence was remains of 11 separate men. Sadly, only 8 of those men were ever able to be identified. Those 8 being 20-year-old John Lee Bayer, 20-year-old Richard Douglas Hamilton, 26-year-old Stephen S. Hale, 28-year-old Alan Wayne Broussard, 31-year-old Jeffrey A. Jones, 31-year-old Manuel Resendez, 33-year-old Roger Allen Goodlett, and 46-year-old Michael Frederick Kiern. Now, I don't have any pictures of these men, but I still thought it important to include their names because they are the ones who truly matter here. But despite the discovery of these remains, police did not immediately arrest Herb. They didn't arrest him. They didn't bring him in for questioning. Nothing. They didn't even mention the bodies to him. He didn't know that anything was amiss until he called his brother to ask for money, and he told him what had been going on at his property. Like, what the fuck are these cops even doing? I promise that I have respect for the law enforcement entities that deserve it, but I think we can all agree that the cops in this case were garbaggio. After speaking to his brother and realizing that his arrest was likely imminent, clearly he didn't know just how lackluster this police force was. Regardless though, Herb fled to Canada on June 30th, 1996. And just 4 days later, on July 3rd, Herb parked his car in Pinery Park in Ontario, where he then proceeded to take his own life. He left a note behind claiming that his failing marriage and failing business were the reason for his actions, and he also made a point in the note to apologize for leaving a mess in the park. So I mean, I guess that was kind of nice of him. Obviously, Herb was never tried or convicted for any of his crimes, so technically he remains an alleged serial killer. But, I mean, like, he probably did it. Unfortunately, no one knows specifically how many lives lost Herb is responsible for, but his count is estimated to be anywhere from the confirmed 11 found on his property to upwards of 21. The up to 21 estimate is based off of eyewitness statements as well as business records later provided to police by Julie that ultimately led Herb to being suspected of killing 9 additional men whose bodies were found in rural areas along Interstate 70 between Indianapolis, Indiana and Columbus, Ohio. His assumed involvement in those crimes has since secured him the nickname the I-70 Strangler. Julie eventually did move she and the children permanently out of Fox Hollow Manor, and the property was later purchased by new owners in 2009. And not long after that, Fox Hollow actually found itself in the spotlight yet again when the new owners supposedly began to experience a ton of paranormal activity in the house. Following these claims, Fox Hollow has since been featured on numerous popular, ghost hunting shows, and experts have supposedly confirmed that there are paranormal happenings taking place on the property, which I guess is kind of crazy depending on what you do or don't believe in. But beyond that, we are wrapped up for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. Before you head out, make sure you give this video a thumbs up. It only takes a second and it really helps out the channel a lot, so thanks in advance. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new true crime or creepy history content each week. and I'd love to catch you back here in my next video. If you want to make sure you don't miss my next video, you might as well turn on the post notifications for the channel. I try really hard to post on Fridays each week, but when it comes to doing so, I'm about as reliable as the cops in this case. So having those turned on will help to make sure that you're notified as soon as I do upload. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.